The widespread use of the war chariot ushered in the second stage of war in early civilization. Cities still needed to be defended, and in wartime were besieged. The war chariot extended the reach of armies, since an army well equipped with war chariots could go on the offensive over extended distances, defeat attempts to stop it, and then besiege and capture cities farther away than before. The only way to stop such an army was with another one, also well armed with war chariots. Offensive warfare based on the war chariot held sway in the Fertile Crescent from about 1500 BCE until at least 1000 BCE, when it began to be supplanted by heavy infantry supported by cavalry, which replaced war chariots on the field over time. Let's deal with cavalry first. Cavalry are soldiers who move and fight on horseback. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, you could just call it Assyria for purposes of quizzes and exams, was the first to make extensive use of cavalry. We think because its army had to operate on terrain too rugged to use war chariots, which were only effective on relatively flat terrain. We know a lot about the Assyrian army from these extensive stone panels taken from excavations on the ruins of Nimrud, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. It's worth noting in passing how much of the archaeological heritage of captured lands and farmer colonies Europeans took, or in other words, plundered. This has not been forgotten by the people now living in those countries. On the other hand, in the case of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it may be just as well that the British took as much as they did, for in 2015, ISIS, who objected to its un-Islamic nature, bulldozed 90% of the Nimrud excavations. This panel shows Assyrian cavalry in combat. Cavalry were possible not just because of the presence of horses in the Fertile Crescent by this time, but the breeding over a long period of time of horses large enough and rugged enough for military use. Such horses had strong enough backs for men to ride them in the center of their backs rather than close to their rear legs, which could help support the weight of the rider, but was inefficient and looked slightly ridiculous. Cavalrymen required a string of horses as well as armaments, but were not as expensive as war chariots, and although it required a skilled man to ride and fight on horseback, the skill involved was not nearly as great as the war chariot. It's no wonder then that cavalry eventually replaced the war chariot throughout the Fertile Crescent. Further, being mounted was already associated with prestige and privilege, starting with the Sumerian war cart and increasingly so with the war chariot. These traits now became associated with riding on horseback. Thus, the war chariot was not needed for that cultural purpose either. This is King Ashur-nasirpal II, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 883 through 859 BCE and greatly expanded the empire through military conquest. But cavalry played a supporting role in the Assyrian army. The arm of decision, that is to say, the arm that now decided the outcome of battles, was now infantry. Tactical and technological developments made infantry effective against both the war chariot and cavalry. Since this was the case, and since fielding an infantryman was only a fraction of the cost of mounted men, infantry would dominate the battlefield over 1,000 years. Tactics enabling infantry formations to fend off war chariots appeared in the late Bronze Age. Infantry thus became effective offensive warriors, which meant larger striking forces. But around 1000 BCE, metallurgists in the Fertile Crescent learned how to cast iron and then forge weapons made of carbonized steel. And since iron was far more available than copper and tin, This became an enormous, this amounted to an enormous change in the way business was done in the ancient military world. Steel increased the ability of weapons to hold an edge, which augmented infantry power and for a time enabled fairly small kingdoms to fend off larger ones. Biblical Israel under Kings Saul, David, and Solomon, for instance, were able to maintain the independence of their kingdom during this period. The mainstay of the Assyrian army was the heavy infantryman, shown at right, but he was aided by auxiliary spearmen, one is shown at left, and the archer in the center. The rise of infantry as the arm of decision, coupled with its greatly reduced cost, enabled armies to become larger, and in the case of Assyria, to become fully professional. The Assyrian Empire expanded so greatly that full-time soldiers became necessary, since sheer distance meant that soldiers had to be on duty for months or even years. As you can see, ultimately the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered the entire Fertile Crescent, the first empire to do so, as well as additional lands to the north and east. This shows the empire at its height in 625 BCE. In addition to infantry and cavalry, the Assyrian army also used battering rams to breach city walls and gain victory much more quickly than by a protracted siege. This stone panel shows Neo-Assyrian archers in action against city walls, and you can see a battering ram in the background. Here is an artist's conception of such a battering ram. You'll see that in addition to its battering function, it also functioned as a platform from which archers could get near enough to the walls of the city to shoot arrows at the defenders on its ramparts. The battering pole itself hung like a pendulum by a rope fixed to the turret roof. This particular model dates from about 800 BCE and did not last long. Later Assyrian rams were just as effective, but lighter and therefore easier to move around. Lastly, the Assyrian kings routinely used terror as a way to frighten captured cities into obedience, and especially as a way to punish conquered cities that rebelled. This stone relief statue shows prisoners being flayed alive. That is to say, their skin is being stripped from their bodies. This is an excerpt from the inscription on the entrance to a temple dedicated to the Assyrian god Ashur, for whom Assyria was named.
Okay, I found this on the web. The kings routinely used terror as a way to frighten captured cities into obedience, and especially as a way to punish conquered cities that rebelled. This stone relief statue, prisoners being flayed alive.
This is my, this interruption comes courtesy of my iPad, which interprets Assyria as "Hey Syria," as "Hey Siri," and likes to help me out with lectures. And I think she's about to go again. So what I'm going to do is, rather than suspend this recording and have to do it all over again, I'm simply going to remove the iPad to another room where it can't be disturbing. This has happened more than once, by the way. Once upon a time in an auditorium where over 100 students could clearly hear Siri interrupt a lecture and offer me, in effect, help in doing my lecture. See, this is the kind of a spontaneous thing that's funny in a face-to-face classroom, but whose humor gets lost in a online course with a recording such as this one. Okay, let me start again with this excerpt thing. This is an excerpt from the inscription on the entrance to a temple dedicated to the Assyrian god Ashur, for whom Assyria was named. The Assyrian king is describing what he did when his army recaptured the rebellious city of Suru. Quote, I built a pillar over against the city gate, and I flayed all of the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and others I bound to stakes round about the pillar. Many others I flayed, and I spread their skins upon the walls, and I cut off the limbs of the royal officers who had rebelled. The chief of the city I took to Nineveh. I flayed him. I spread his skin upon the wall of Nineveh. The point being, don't rebel against our empire. Now, we've dealt for some time with military weapon systems, spearmen, archers, war carts, war chariots, cavalry, and infantry. Military historians pay extensive attention to the types of forces and the weapons they used, since ultimately war centers on combat. But it is dangerously off base to reduce the history of war to the history of technological development, for military history needs to be understood in a much larger context. An important dimension of this context is grand strategy. To understand grand strategy, it's important to understand the hierarchy of strategy. Strategy can be defined as the decision-making involved in the employment of the means available to achieve the desired objective. At the level of fighting on a battlefield, the use of forces to best achieve victory isn't quite strategy. It's often called grand tactics. Tactics, in turn, are the employment of weapon systems in combat. And by weapon systems, I mean infantry with their armaments, their spear and shield, their sword and shield, archers wielding the compound bow, war chariots, that particular weapon system, cavalry. That's what I'm talking about in the realm of such forces. It's above grand tactics that you reach the true level of strategy. Operational strategy refers to the use of means to achieve victory in a military campaign. And the campaign can require months and involve much marching, maneuvering to advantage, and usually several battles before the aim of the campaign is achieved or thwarted, depending on whether the operational strategy is that of the attacker or the defender. Above operational strategy is military strategy, the decision-making concerning the armed forces, what size it's going to be, what type the soldiers are going to be, and so on. And above that, finally, we reach the level of grand strategy. Grand strategy refers to the employment of all resources to achieve the aims of a state. And a state is an umbrella term that encompasses any kind of state. So kingdom, empire, as shown on the screen, but also city-states, like the Greek city-states, or far into the future, nation-states, like present-day United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and so on. We will talk of grand strategy in the sense of what would now be called national security strategy. It is based on the identification of objectives the state wants to achieve and the means it uses to obtain those objectives. DIME is a useful acronym by which to remember these means. By the way, DIME is an acronym that comes out of the defense establishment, and which I taught to students when I was a visiting professor at the Army War College some years ago. Diplomatic power refers to the use of negotiating relations with other states. In ancient times, this included the dispatch of ambassadors to maintain relationships with other states and to transmit information about one's own state's wants and needs. Also, the use of intimidation to secure objectives without fighting. Give us what we want or we'll use our army to get it. Or, nice kingdom you got there. Too bad something could happen to it. The conclusion of peace treaties was another function of diplomatic power, and also the securing of alliances. Information power in the modern world involves a variety of things, but in the ancient world, it referred primarily to public policy statements, one such public policy statement being flaying rebels alive. Military power is obvious. The use of military force to deter attack, to add leverage to the diplomatic use of negotiation, or to make credible diplomatic attempts at intimidation, and obviously to use warfare to gain one's objective. Finally, economic power refers to the promotion of trade, trade alliances, the promotion of internal development to generate wealth that could, among other things, be appropriated to pay for armies, the means of military power, and also to pay for great monuments and other works of art intended to underscore the power and prestige of the ruler. At the risk, actually the certainty, of oversimplification, ancient kingdoms and empires had two main forms of grand strategy. The strategy of the satisfied power, based on defense, strong political consolidation, internal development, and cultural hegemony, which is to say a high culture of art, philosophy, and religion that was attractive to people from outside the state. And the strategy of the acquisitive power, based on offense, expansion, loose political consolidation, and cultural pluralism. That is to say, acquisitive powers often left the existing political arrangements of a conquered area intact, also the local religion and so on, and demanded from them only that they pay tribute to the king, to remain obedient, no rebellions, and to have no foreign policy of their own. Egypt was a classic example of a satisfied power. Egyptian pharaohs had what they wanted already: a strong economy that generated great wealth, with extensive trade that added to it, a firm grip on political power within the kingdom, the development of an extensive infrastructure for transportation of trade goods within the kingdom and to permit rapid communication throughout the kingdom, and a strong culture that remains impressive even today. Egypt could afford this strategy because it was difficult to attack. Attack from the western desert was completely out of the question. To the south, the Nile River Valley, the only means of approach, was protected by a system of fortified cities. To the north, an enemy could only approach from the sea, which was impossible except for states with extensive maritime power, which a few enemies did. And to the east, the narrow isthmus between the Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea constituted a natural line of defense, but Egypt usually mounted a forward defense by holding fortified cities in what would now be the state of Israel. This did not mean that Egypt could not be invaded successfully. This happened on a couple of occasions when invaders made partial incursions, and finally when the Assyrians conquered the whole kingdom. Assyria was obviously an acquisitive power. Its empire was eventually destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, another acquisitive empire that we won't worry about, which in turn was destroyed by the Persian Empire, which emerged from what is today Iran and obviously captured an area that eventually dwarfed the Assyrian Empire. This conquest, using an army much larger than the Assyrian army, but also built on infantry supported by cavalry, began under King Cyrus, rightly called Cyrus the Great, in 550 BCE. By 490 BCE, just 60 years, the Persian Empire dominated Western Asia, the entire Fertile Crescent, all of present-day Turkey, and even had an enclave in Europe. This map shows Persia on the eve of the first invasion of Greece. And here we will stop because we'll be discussing the battles between Persia and Greece and Greek warfare in general starting next week.